Hello viewers, today we will talk about the Great Divergence and the challenge that Kenneth Pomeranz posed in the studies of capitalism. Generally speaking, studies in the evolution and story of capitalism have tended to be somewhat Eurocentric in their orientation. Studies in the history and nature of capitalism began when scholars and observers of industrialization tried to understand why it came about in Europe rather than anywhere else, and why even in Britain rather than anywhere else in Europe. Scholars have tried variously to explain the exact nature of connection between capitalism and industrialization to figure out why it happened where and when it did. So some scholars have tried to argue that Europe was distinctive from the rest of the world in being uniquely suited to the emergence of the industrial mode of production. Yet other scholars have argued that Britain was more suited to the phenomenon than any other European country because of the more refined form in which capitalism had come to emerge there in course of the 18th century. This largely Eurocentric view of capitalism has been challenged by the works of a series of historians in the last quarter century or so, among whom the most radical challenge had come from Kenneth Pomeranz, which is the subject of our discussion today. Pomeranz's challenge came in two parts. He argued that contrary to the general belief of scholars of capitalism, Europe as a whole had not developed into a single integrated capitalist model which was more sophisticated than anywhere else in the 19th century, and that there were many regions or sub-regions in different parts of Asia, especially, for instance, the Yangtze Valley in China, the Gujarat region of India, the Edo area in Japan, that were nearly as developed along the matrices of capitalism as England had in the 18th century. He also argued that the real divergence between the European capitalist model and those elsewhere in the world was to emerge in the 19th century, not in the 18th, but in the 19th century, owing to a wide range of conjunctural factors rather than any essential superiority of the Western capitalist model, as all other scholars have so far argued. Pomeranz argues this explains even more easily why some of the societies of the East, that is to say Asia, such as China and Japan, have managed to catch up with the West with a relative ease against other societies such as in sub-Saharan Africa. So that is to say, because of the greater advances made in Asiatic societies like China and Japan in sub-regions, albeit in sub-regions, nevertheless, the advances that were made over there allowed these countries to recover from the backwardness with greater ease than was the case in other parts of the world, which had seen even less development along the trajectory of capitalism, if at all. It is important, therefore, in order to understand Pomeranz, to situate him in the study of capitalism as a whole. The study of capitalism, properly speaking, begins in the mid-19th century with Karl Marx's study of the famous book Das Kapital, which was a milestone in this regard because it explained how industrialization was the quintessential form of the capitalist mode of production and how industrialization as a phenomenon is inextricably connected with the theory of surplus capital in a deeply materialistic culture. And this he was referring, of course, to Europe. Towards the later part of the century, the German sociologist Max Weber challenged this essentially materialistic position by connecting the Protestant ethic, which predominantly characterized the Dutch, German, and British cultures, with capitalism as a phenomenon, and thus with industrialism. That is to say, the Protestant countries of Europe were more culturally equipped, better equipped to move in the direction of capitalist advance than the Catholic countries of Europe, and Britain, being adrift from the rest of the continent, had an even better set of advantages, and that needs to be understood. At around the same time that Max Weber was talking about his thesis, the historian Arnold Toynbee began the trend of studying the uniqueness of Britain in the 18th century as against the rest of Europe, on the strength of its being the first country to industrialize. A whole generation of historians then followed Toynbee, who built along that line, studying in meticulous details as to why England emerged so uniquely suited to be the first country to industrialize. They sought answers in such things as the climate of the British Isles, location of coal deposits, colonies that she could exploit, etc. Now, all of these arguments had a value to add, but nevertheless they did not satisfy the crucial question as to why Britain as against the rest of Europe, and why the rest of Europe as against the rest of the world. By the middle of the 20th century, other equally influential historians moved exactly in this direction by beginning to contend that England's industrialization was part of a much broader socio-economic development that was being witnessed all over Europe, and that industrialization was actually a pan-European phenomenon on account of the capitalist model of development that was evolutionary in nature rather than an England-specific phenomenon, which was revolutionary in nature. Among the most persuasive of such arguments was that of Emanuel Wallerstein, who argued that European capitalism as a phenomenon which resulted in the rise of which emanated out of a global system of commercial exchange, of which Europe was the core, and all the other continents happened to be peripheries of it. It followed that the dynamics generated by that world system impelled Europe towards a mode of production that was geared towards relentless growth, hence allowing Europe to resort to mechanization of production. The problem with this particular line of argument that has dominated the historiography of capitalism all through the 19th and 20th centuries is, of course, that it implies that being so uniquely equipped with all sorts of advantages, Europe alone was able to craft the capitalist paradigm, meaning the only possible capitalist paradigm, which inevitably moved in the direction of industrialization. That is to say, the European model was a prototype which all had to follow, and once you follow that line, you move inevitably in the direction of industrialization. And of course, the other implication was that no other part of the world was capable of evolving in the manner and the direction in which Europe had evolved. To most historians sharing the Eurocentric disposition that we have spoken of, this seemed a reasonable proposition, considering Europe was, after all, the first continent to move as a whole in the direction of industrialization. As Alexander Gerschenkron had argued, all the regions of Europe lacked one factor or the other in the path to industrialization, and therefore had to find a substitute for them. But they all easily managed to be on the path nevertheless. So even if they had a factor or two missing, they were roughly on the broad trajectory that reached its most refined form in the British Isles. Historians like Kenneth Pomerantz take issue precisely at this point, questioning whether it is right to assume, first, that all European countries were necessarily on that path, or to assume that only European countries happened to be on that path. If that was indeed the case, then how does one explain why some countries fared better than the rest when it came to catching up, when they started playing to catch up? Pomerantz went on to argue that the development of capitalist features in the 18th century was not a uniquely European experience, that enclaves of capitalist mode of production developed in parts of Asia that we have mentioned, that is to say, the Yangtze Valley in China, Gujarat, the Edo region in Japan, and thus the trajectory of European development was not unique till as late as the 1800. It was only in the 19th century, Pomerantz argues, as large-scale industrialization came about, that divergence began to emerge between Europe and other parts of the world. So what is the Pomerantz thesis? The central thesis of Kenneth Pomerantz is that the trajectory of capitalist development in Europe was not startlingly unusual before the breakout phase of mechanization happened, and that for a time in the 18th century, the eastern seaboard of China was nearly as close to the transition from proto-industry to the next stage as England had been. Pomerantz argues that the divergent experiences of Europe and the rest of the world was not brought about by the evolution of capitalism culminating in the emergence of industrial economy, rather that it was the gradual emergence of industrial economy in the 19th century that caused the great divergence between Europe and the rest of the world. So it's not that the trajectory of Europe's development caused the divergence by allowing Europe to industrialize, but it was rather the industrialization that sort of pushed Europe in almost a different league from the rest of the world. Thus, both the issues of uniqueness of the trajectory of Britain's capitalist development and that of Europe, according to Pomerantz, needs to be revisited. Pomerantz contends that in the early 18th century, there were a number of regions in different parts of Asia, et alibi, where the cardinal features of proto-industrial production obtained much the same as in northwestern Europe. In the densely populated Yangtze Valley of China, which is what Pomerantz knows the best, he argues proto-industry developed as much as it did in the north of England or in the southern reaches of the German-speaking lands. Given the pressure on agricultural land mounted by its ever-burgeoning population, peasantry in the Yangtze Valley resorted to producing artisanal activity in order to supplement their incomes. This activity was largely at the behest of the merchants in nearby towns, generating demand for rural manufacture that was meant to cater to a distant market. Following, if you follow, almost to the last detail, developments in their corresponding European cases. So exactly what was happening in 18th century England, Pomerantz argues, was also happening in 18th century China. Pomerantz argues that there were several such enclaves of proto-industrial activity in quite a few parts of Qing China, some in Tokugawa and Meiji Japan, Korea, and India, each of which had a level of sophistication comparable with the European prototype. At the same time, proto-industrial activity in the West was also located only in enclaves. So it's not simply that proto-industrial activity in Asia was in enclaves and it was sweeping across the floor in Europe. In Europe, as much as in Asia, proto-industrial activity was essentially in enclaves. In the north of England and Thames Basin, for instance, around London, rather than all over the British Isles. If you're looking at the German-speaking Central Europe, then it was located more in the Rhineland region of the southwest than in the German north. It was located more in the north of France and the northern regions of Italy rather than the south. And neither did all parts of Europe, nor indeed Britain, saw proto-industrial activities make way readily for industrial activity. So wherever industrialization happened, wherever mechanization of production happened, it happened on the back of proto-industrial activity for sure. But wherever proto-industrial activity happened, it did not necessarily lead to mechanization of production. In fact, in the early 18th century, sometimes European proto-industrial activity paled in significance before their Asiatic counterparts, such as was the case with the Bengal textile industry, imports from which were the rage in the European market, and so much so that at one stage, the British textile industry brought in protective tariffs to safeguard their own production against textile imports from Bengal. Pomerantz argues that it was this essential sophistication of proto-industrial activities in different parts of China, Japan, Korea, and India that allowed them later to catch up on the advance that was made in the West in the 19th century when they tried to play catch up, that is, in the 20th. This catch up was done within a short period of time without importing in toto either the capitalist mode of production devised in Europe or America, or even the labor displacing capital intensive technology necessarily that characterized the Western industrial experience. So to come to the point of the Great Divergence, what was it that caused the capitalist model as it emerged in Northwestern Europe to heave ahead of the rest of the world and make the European experience completely divergent from the rest of the world, relegating the rest of the world to relative backwardness? Pomerantz argues that the divergence did not readily come into place in the 18th century when mechanization of production began, primarily in the textile manufacturing sector of Britain. It rather took place in the 19th century when productive capacity of the European manufacturing sector crossed a major hurdle, that of the limited nature of land resources. Collating data from a broad range of sources, Pomerantz contended that historically there had been quite a few growth spurts in the realm of economic activity, of which the proto-industrial era in Europe was just another example. China had a similar growth spurt in the middle of 18th century as well, as late as the middle of 18th century. But historically, most growth spurts have tended to be hobbled by restrictive limits posed by the use of land resources. That is to say, as economy expands, population expands with it, till the point where the land resources can no longer sustain that level of growth, and then the spurt dies out. The opportunities that unfolded in the 18th century China and other parts of Asia on account of proto-industrial activity were eventually hobbled by restrictive practices of land use in place in these societies, and the limits of expanding productivity of the limited land resources within the given technological regime. The growth could not become self-sustained. Pomerantz argues, however, that as the old world of Europe fast approached the limits of its own growth potential, its access to the land resources of the New World, through migration in the mid-19th century primarily, both reduced the pressure on land in the old world and unlocked the productive potential of the new. British textile industry of Manchester and Lancashire became the engine of relentless growth, not on the strength of cotton produced in Britain, not even on the strength of cotton produced in India, rather on account of the supplies it received from what was to become the United States of America. The markets of the New World were also no less important in sustaining the drive towards relentless growth. It was this opening out of Europe into the New World in the 19th century, as large number of Europeans simply packed up their bags and left for the Americas, Pomerantz asserts, that constituted the Great Divergence, which propelled the West ahead of the rest. An era of relentless growth was not the product of new technology alone, but also of overcoming the limitations of existing land use, allowing growth to become totally relentless for the first time. China, he seems to imply, is now catching up in 20th and 21st centuries, having overcome such limitations on the nature of land use that characterized the country till that time. That is to say, China did not make the crucial leap from proto-industrial to industrial mode of production till it arranged to overcome its limitations in restrictive land use practices, which China has done in the 20th century, mid-20th century onwards, and therefore China is now on the path of capitalist development in a manner similar to Europe. To sum up, therefore, the challenge posed by Kenneth Pomeranz to the academic orthodoxy on both the studies of industrialization narratives and to the history of capitalism has been quite profound. Other historians, such as Prasannan Parthasarathi, have followed Pomeranz's lead to argue that different trajectories of capitalism were indeed developing in the world outside of Europe, such as in South Asia. Others, however, such as Patrick O'Brien, have gone on to try and bring back the earlier Eurocentric focus in the story of capitalism by arguing more in favor of the significance of the technological regime and what underlay the technological shift between Europe and the rest of the world, the Pomeranz thesis in the main frame of its understanding of capitalism.